The marble floors of the Whitmore mansion gleamed under the crystal chandeliers as Victoria carefully dusted the antique furniture in the grand living room. She had been working for the Whitmore family for nearly 8 years, ever since her husband died, and left her with nothing but bills and a broken heart. At 42, Victoria had learned to keep her head down, do her work well, and stay invisible to the wealthy family that employed her. Richard Whitmore III was one of the most powerful men in the city. His technology empire had made him worth over $2 billion, and his influence reached into every corner of the business world. He was known for his cold efficiency, his perfectionist nature, and his complete dedication to maintaining his family's reputation. The Whitmore name had been respected for generations, and Richard intended to keep it that way. His daughter Emma was 23 years old, and everything Richard had hoped for in an heir. She was beautiful, intelligent, and had just graduated from Harvard Business School with top honors. Emma was supposed to marry Jonathan Blackwell, the son of another wealthy family, in a union that would merge two powerful business dynasties. The engagement had been announced 6 months ago, and the wedding was planned for the following spring. Victoria had watched Emma grow up from a distance. She remembered when Emma was a rebellious teenager who would sneak out at night, when she was a college student who came home with different boyfriends every holiday, and now as a young woman who seemed to have everything in life handed to her. Victoria had always been professional and polite, but she never imagined she would become personally involved in the family's private affairs. The trouble began on a Tuesday evening in late October. Richard had been working late in his home office, reviewing contracts for a major acquisition that would add another $500 million to his empire. The house was quiet except for the sound of his fingers typing on the keyboard and the distant hum of the air conditioning system. Victoria was supposed to have finished her work hours ago, but she had stayed late to prepare for a dinner party Richard was hosting the following evening. She was in the kitchen, polishing silverware and checking that everything was perfect for the important guests who would be arriving. Victoria took pride in her work, and she knew that Richard expected nothing less than perfection. Emma was supposed to be at a charity gala with Jonathan, but she had developed a headache and decided to come home early. She entered through the side door to avoid disturbing her father, who she knew would be working late. Emma had been feeling overwhelmed lately with all the wedding preparations, the expectations placed on her, and the pressure to be the perfect daughter of a billionaire. What Richard discovered that night would change everything for his family, his business, and his carefully constructed world. Richard finished his work around 11:30 and decided to check on the house before going to bed. It was a habit he had developed over the years, making sure all the doors were locked and the security system was properly set. He walked through the main floor, checking the windows and doors when he noticed a light still on in the guest wing of the house. The guest wing was rarely used except when they had overnight visitors, so Richard was surprised to see any activity there. He walked quietly down the long hallway, his expensive leather shoes making soft sounds on the hardwood floors. As he approached the room where the light was coming from, he could hear voices speaking in low tones. Richard paused outside the door, not wanting to interrupt if Emma was having a private conversation with a friend. But something about the voices made him curious. One voice was definitely Emma's, but the other voice sounded familiar in a way that he couldn't quite place. He moved closer to the door and listened carefully. The voices were coming from Emma's old bedroom, which she had used as a teenager before moving to the master suite on the second floor. Richard rarely went into that room anymore, and he wondered why Emma would be there at this hour. Through a small gap in the door, Richard could see into the room. What he saw made his blood run cold and his hands shake with rage. Emma was lying on the bed, wearing only a silk nightgown, her arms wrapped around Victoria, the family's maid. Victoria was stroking Emma's hair gently, and they were talking in whispers about something Richard couldn't quite hear. But their body language made it clear that this was not a conversation between an employer's daughter and a servant. Richard watched in shock as Emma kissed Victoria softly on the lips, and Victoria responded by pulling her closer. They moved together with the familiarity of lovers who had been intimate many times before, not the awkward uncertainty of a first encounter. Richard's mind raced as he tried to process what he was seeing. His daughter, who was engaged to marry into one of the most prominent families in the country, was having an affair with their black maid. The scandal would destroy everything he had worked for, everything his family represented, and everything he had planned for Emma's future. Richard stepped back from the door, his heart pounding so hard he was afraid they might hear it. He needed to think carefully about how to handle this situation. His first instinct was to burst into the room and confront them both immediately, but years of business negotiations had taught him that acting in anger rarely led to the best outcomes. He walked quietly back to his office and closed the door, his mind spinning with the implications of what he had discovered. The Whitmore family had built their fortune and reputation on being above scandal, on being the kind of people that others looked up to and respected. If word of this affair got out, it would not only ruin Emma's engagement, but could also damage his business relationships and social standing. Richard poured himself a large glass of whiskey and sat down at his desk, staring out the window at the city lights below. He had dealt with hostile takeovers, corporate espionage, and ruthless competitors, but nothing had prepared him for this personal crisis. He needed to find a way to handle this situation that would protect his family's reputation and ensure that Emma's future remained on track. As he sat there thinking, Richard began to formulate a plan. He would need to separate Emma and Victoria immediately, but he would have to do it in a way that didn't create more problems. If he simply fired Victoria, she might go to the press or try to blackmail the family. If he confronted Emma directly, she might rebel and make the situation even worse. Richard spent the rest of the night planning his next moves, occasionally getting up to pace around his office as he considered different approaches. By the time the sun began to rise, he had decided on a course of action that he believed would solve the problem quietly and permanently. The next morning, Victoria arrived at work as usual, unaware that her world was about to be turned upside down. She went through her normal routine, preparing breakfast for the family and beginning her daily cleaning schedule. She had no idea that Richard had discovered her secret relationship with Emma, and she certainly had no idea what he was planning to do about it. Emma slept late, which was not unusual for her. She had been staying up late frequently, often sneaking down to spend time with Victoria after the rest of the house was asleep. Emma had been struggling with her feelings for months, torn between the life her father expected her to live and the happiness she had found with Victoria. Their relationship had begun innocently enough. Emma had been going through a difficult time after a bad breakup during her final year at Harvard, and Victoria had been kind to her, listening to her problems and offering gentle advice. Over time, their conversations had become more personal, and Emma had found herself looking forward to Victoria's company more than anyone else's. The physical relationship had developed gradually, starting with innocent touches and progresses to stolen kisses when no one else was around. Emma had never been with a woman before, but being with Victoria felt more natural and right than anything she had ever experienced with men. Victoria, for her part, had tried to resist her growing feelings for Emma. She knew that getting involved with her employer's daughter was dangerous and could cost her the job she desperately needed. But Emma's persistence and genuine affection had worn down her defenses, and she had found herself falling in love despite all her rational objections. Now, as Victoria went about her morning duties, she had no idea that Richard was watching her every move, waiting for the right moment to put his plan into action. She hummed softly to herself as she worked, thinking about the conversation she had had with Emma the night before about possibly telling Richard about their relationship. Emma had been growing tired of sneaking around and hiding their love. She wanted to be able to be open about her feelings, even though she knew her father would be angry. Victoria had been more cautious, knowing that the consequences would be much more severe for her than for Emma. Richard waited until Victoria was alone in the laundry room before making his move. He walked in quietly and closed the door behind him, causing Victoria to jump in surprise. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, putting her hand to her chest. You startled me. Is there something you need? Richard looked at her for a long moment, his face showing no emotion. Victoria had always found him intimidating, with his cold blue eyes and stern expression, but there was something different about the way he was looking at her now that made her feel genuinely afraid. We need to talk, Victoria, Richard said, his voice calm, but with an underlying threat that made her stomach clench with anxiety. Victoria set down the laundry she had been folding and turned to face him fully. Of course, Mr. Whitmore. What can I help you with? Richard walked closer to her, and Victoria instinctively stepped back until she was pressed against the washing machine. He was much taller than her, and his presence filled the small room in a way that made her feel trapped. I know about you and Emma, Richard said simply. The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. Her knees went weak, and she had to grip the edge of the washing machine to keep from falling. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her worst nightmare was coming true. I saw you together last night, Richard continued, his voice still eerily calm. I know everything. Victoria's mind raced as she tried to think of something to say, some way to explain or defend herself. But she knew there was no point in denying what Richard had seen. The only question now was what he was going to do about it. Mr. Whitmore, I can explain, Victoria finally managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. No, Richard said, cutting her off. You cannot explain this. There is no explanation that would make this acceptable. You have violated my trust, corrupted my daughter, and put my family's reputation at risk. Victoria felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. She had known this day might come, but she had hoped that somehow they could find a way to be together without anyone getting hurt. Now she realized how foolish that hope had been. What are you going to do? Victoria asked, dreading the answer. Richard smiled, but it was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who held all the power and intended to use it. That depends on how cooperative you are, Richard said. I have a proposition for you, Victoria. A way that we can resolve this situation that benefits everyone involved. Victoria waited for him to continue, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. You're going to leave this house today and never return, Richard said. You will have no further contact with Emma, no phone calls, no letters, no accidental meetings. You will disappear from her life completely. But, Mr. Whitmore, Victoria started to protest. I'm not finished, Richard said sharply. In exchange for your cooperation, I am prepared to offer you a very generous severance package. Enough money to start a new life somewhere else, far away from here. Victoria stared at him in shock. She had expected him to fire her, but she had not expected him to try to buy her off. How much? She heard herself asking. $1 million, Richard said. Tax-free. Cash. Enough for you to buy a house, start a business, do whatever you want with your life. All you have to do is walk away and never look back. Victoria's mind reeled at the amount. $1 million was more money than she had ever imagined having. It would solve all her financial problems and give her the security she had been working toward her entire life. But it would also mean giving up the woman she loved and the happiness she had found. And if I refuse? Victoria asked, though she was afraid to hear the answer. Richard's expression grew darker. If you refuse, I will destroy you. I will have you arrested for theft. I have security cameras throughout this house, and I'm certain we can find evidence of you taking something that doesn't belong to you. I will make sure you never work again, never find a decent place to live, never have a moment's peace. I will ruin your life so completely that you will wish you had taken my offer. Victoria felt sick to her stomach. She knew that Richard had the power and resources to make good on his threats. A man with his wealth and influence could make her life a living hell if he chose to. I need time to think, Victoria said weakly. You have until this afternoon, Richard said. I want your answer by 5 o'clock. If you agree to my terms, the money will be transferred to an account of your choosing, and you will be on a plane out of the city tonight. If you refuse, I will call the police immediately. Richard turned to leave, then paused at the door. And "Victoria," he said without turning around, "if you say one word about this conversation to Emma, the offer is off the table, and I will destroy you anyway." With that, he left Victoria alone in the laundry room, shaking and trying to process what had just happened. Her entire world had just collapsed in the span of 5 minutes, and she had no idea how she was going to tell the woman she loved that their relationship was over. Victoria spent the next several hours in a state of complete emotional turmoil. She went through the motions of her daily work, but her mind was entirely focused on the impossible choice Richard had given her. Every time she thought about taking his money and leaving, her heart broke a little more. But every time she considered refusing his offer, she was terrified by the threats he had made. Emma came downstairs around noon, looking beautiful and refreshed after her late night. She smiled when she saw Victoria in the kitchen and walked over to give her a quick hug when no one else was around. "Good morning, beautiful," Emma whispered in Victoria's ear. "Did you sleep well after I left?" Victoria tried to smile back, but she could feel tears threatening to spill over. Emma immediately noticed that something was wrong. "What's the matter?" Emma asked, her voice filled with concern. "You look like you've been crying." Victoria glanced around to make sure they were alone, then looked into Emma's eyes. She wanted desperately to tell Emma everything that had happened, to warn her about her father's threats, to ask for her help in figuring out what to do. But Richard's warning echoed in her mind, and she knew that involving Emma would only make things worse for both of them. "I'm just tired," Victoria said, forcing her voice to sound normal. "I stayed up too late last night, and I have a lot of work to catch up on today." Emma studied Victoria's face carefully. She had learned to read Victoria's moods over the months they had been together, and she knew that something more serious was bothering her. But before she could press the issue further, Richard walked into the kitchen. "Good morning, Emma," Richard said, his voice warm and affectionate as he kissed his daughter on the cheek. "I trust you slept well." "Yes, father," Emma replied, though Victoria noticed she seemed a little nervous around Richard. "I was just talking to Victoria about the dinner party tonight. Everything should be ready." Richard's eyes moved to Victoria, and she saw a cold warning in his gaze. "I'm sure Victoria has everything under control," he said. "She's always been very reliable." The way he emphasized the word reliable sent a chill down Victoria's spine. She understood the message he was sending her. "Actually," Richard continued, "I need to speak with Victoria about some changes to tonight's arrangements. Victoria, could you come to my office in an hour?" Victoria's stomach dropped, but she managed to nod. "Of course, Mr. Whitmore." Emma looked between her father and Victoria, sensing tension but not understanding its source. "Is everything all right?" she asked. "Everything is perfect, darling," Richard said, putting his arm around Emma's shoulders. "In fact, I have some news that I think will make you very happy. Jonathan called this morning. He's going to propose to you officially tonight in front of all our guests." Emma's face went pale, and Victoria saw her hands trembling slightly. "Tonight?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Richard said, beaming with pride. "He's already spoken to me about it, of course, and I've given my blessing. He has a beautiful ring, and he's planned something very special for the proposal. All our friends will be there to witness it. It will be a perfect evening." Victoria watched as Emma struggled to maintain her composure. She could see the panic in Emma's eyes, the desperate way she glanced toward Victoria for some kind of support or escape. But Victoria could do nothing to help her without making the situation even worse. "That's wonderful, Father," Emma managed to say, though her voice sounded strained. "I should go get ready." "Excellent," Richard said. "I know how happy this will make you, Emma. This is exactly the kind of future our family deserves." Emma left the kitchen quickly, and Victoria could tell she was fighting back tears. Richard watched his daughter go, then turned back to Victoria with a satisfied expression. 1 hour, he reminded her, then left Victoria alone with her breaking heart. Victoria somehow managed to get through the next hour of work, though she felt like she was moving through a nightmare. She kept thinking about Emma's face when Richard announced the engagement, the look of trapped desperation that Victoria recognized because she was feeling the same thing herself. When the hour was up, Victoria walked slowly to Richard's office and knocked on the heavy wooden door. "Come in," Richard called. Victoria entered the office and closed the door behind her. Richard was sitting behind his massive mahogany desk, looking every inch the powerful billionaire who was used to getting exactly what he wanted. "Have you made your decision?" Richard asked without any preliminary pleasantries. Victoria took a deep breath. She had spent the entire hour trying to find some alternative, some way to fight back against Richard's ultimatum. But she had come up empty. She had no money for lawyers, no connections to help her, and no evidence to prove her innocence if Richard decided to frame her for theft. She was completely at his mercy. "I'll take your offer," Victoria said quietly. Richard smiled, and Victoria could see the satisfaction in his eyes. "I thought you would see reason," he said. "You're making the right choice, Victoria. This is what's best for everyone involved." "What's best for everyone?" Victoria repeated, anger finally breaking through her fear. "You're destroying your daughter's happiness, and you're threatening an innocent woman. How is that best for anyone?" Richard's expression hardened. "My daughter will thank me for this someday," he said coldly. "When she's married to Jonathan and living the life she was meant to live, she'll understand that I saved her from making a terrible mistake. And as for you being innocent, we both know that's not true. You seduced my daughter, took advantage of her confusion, and manipulated her for your own selfish purposes." "That's not what happened," Victoria protested. "Emma pursued me. I tried to resist because I knew it was complicated, but she was persistent. We fell in love, Mr. Whitmore. What we have is real. What you have is an infatuation that will pass," Richard said dismissively. "Emma is young and impressionable. She'll forget about you soon enough, especially once she's married and has real responsibilities to focus on." Victoria felt tears running down her cheeks, but she wiped them away angrily. She refused to let Richard see her completely broken. "I'll need the money transferred to my bank account," Victoria said, try to maintain some dignity. "And I'll need time to pack my things." "The money will be transferred within the hour," Richard said, opening a file folder on his desk. "I've already made the arrangements. As for packing, you can take your personal belongings, but you have until 6 o'clock to be out of this house. A car will be waiting to take you to the airport." "6 o'clock?" Victoria repeated in shock. "But the dinner party starts at 7. I'm supposed to help serve." "I've already arranged for temporary help for tonight," Richard said. "Your services will no longer be required." The finality of his words hit Victoria like a punch to the stomach. After 8 years of working for this family, 8 years of dedicating her life to maintaining their home and supporting their lifestyle, she was being discarded like garbage. "What am I supposed to tell Emma?" Victoria asked desperately. "She'll want to know where I went." "You will tell Emma nothing," Richard said firmly. "You will leave a letter saying that you've accepted a position with another family in another city, and that you left suddenly because the opportunity was too good to pass up. You will thank the family for their kindness and wish Emma well in her upcoming marriage." "She won't believe it," Victoria said. "She knows I would never leave without talking to her first." "She'll believe it because she'll have to," Richard said. "And if you're thinking about contacting her later to explain the real situation, I would strongly advise against it. I meant what I said about destroying you if you don't hold up your end of our agreement." Victoria stared at Richard for a long moment, seeing clearly for the first time the kind of man he really was. She had always known he was ruthless in business, but she had never imagined he could be so cold and calculating with his own daughter's happiness. "You're going to regret this," Victoria said quietly. "Emma is going to hate you when she finds out what you've done." "Emma will never find out," Richard replied confidently. "And even if she does, she'll understand that I was protecting her from a mistake that would have ruined her life." Victoria turned to leave, but Richard's voice stopped her at the door. "Victoria," he said, and when she turned back, his expression had softened slightly. "For what it's worth, I don't take any pleasure in this. You've been a good employee, and I know you care about Emma. But I have to protect my family's interests, and sometimes that means making difficult decisions. Victoria looked at him with disgust. Don't pretend this is difficult for you, she said. This is just business to you, isn't it? Emma's happiness, my life. None of it matters as long as you get what you want. You're right, Richard said, his voice returning to its cold tone. This is business. And in business, you do whatever it takes to win. Victoria left his office without another word and went directly to her small room on the third floor to begin packing her few possessions. Her hands shook as she folded her clothes and gathered her personal items, thinking about how she was going to survive this heartbreak. As she packed, Victoria could hear the sounds of preparation for the dinner party beginning downstairs. The temporary staff Richard had hired was already arriving, and she could hear Emma's voice giving directions about table settings and flower arrangements. Emma sounded stressed and unhappy, which made Victoria's heart break even more. Victoria sat down at the small desk in her room and picked up a pen to write the letter Richard had demanded. She stared at the blank paper for several minutes, trying to find words that would sound believable without being a complete betrayal of everything she and Emma had shared together. Finally, she began to write, Dear Emma, by the time you read this, I will be gone. I have been offered a position with a family in Chicago that I cannot refuse. The opportunity came up suddenly, and I had to make a quick decision. I know this seems abrupt, and I'm sorry I couldn't say goodbye in person, but sometimes life doesn't give us the luxury of perfect timing. Victoria paused in her writing, wiping away tears that were making it difficult to see the paper clearly. Every word felt like a lie, but she knew that any hint of the truth would bring Richard's wrath down on both her and Emma. She continued, I want you to know that working for your family has been one of the greatest privileges of my life. You have grown into a remarkable young woman, and I know you will find happiness in your marriage to Jonathan. He is a lucky man to have won your heart. That last sentence made Victoria feel physically sick, but she forced herself to keep writing. Please don't try to contact me or find me. This new position requires my complete focus, and I need to start this new chapter of my life with no distractions from the past. I hope you'll understand and respect my decision. Victoria signed the letter simply Victoria and sealed it in an envelope with Emma's name on it. She left it on the pillow of Emma's old bed, where she knew Emma would find it later. As 6 o'clock approached, Victoria finished packing her suitcase and took one last look around the room that had been her home for 8 years. It wasn't much, just a small bedroom with basic furniture, but it had been her sanctuary, and leaving it felt like leaving behind the only security she had ever known. Victoria carried her suitcase downstairs and slipped out through the servants' entrance, avoiding the main areas of the house where the dinner party preparations were taking place. She couldn't bear the thought of seeing Emma one last time, knowing that she would have to pretend everything was normal. A black sedan was waiting for her in the driveway, just as Richard had promised. The driver took her suitcase and held the door open for her without speaking. As the car pulled away from the Whitmore mansion, Victoria turned to look back at the house where she had lived and worked for so many years, where she had found love and lost it in the same day. She could see lights beginning to come on in the windows as the first guests arrived for the dinner party. In a few hours, Jonathan would propose to Emma in front of all their friends and family, and Emma would have to accept with a smile, not knowing that the woman she loved had been forced to disappear from her life. Victoria closed her eyes and tried not to think about what Emma would go through when she discovered the letter, when she realized that Victoria had abandoned her without explanation on the very night she was expected to get engaged to another man. The timing was cruel beyond words, but Victoria knew that Richard had planned it that way deliberately. At the airport, Victoria checked her phone and saw that the money had been transferred to her account, exactly as Richard had promised. $1 million. More money than she had ever imagined having, and it felt like blood money in her hands. Victoria bought a ticket on the next flight to a city where she had never been before, somewhere she could disappear completely and try to build a new life. As the plane took off, she looked down at the lights of the city she was leaving behind and wondered if Emma would ever forgive her for leaving, even if Emma never learned the real reason why. Back at the Whitmore mansion, the dinner party was in full swing. Emma moved through the evening like an actress playing a role, smiling at the guests, making polite conversation, and pretending to be excited about her future with Jonathan. But inside, she felt hollow and desperate, going through the motions while her heart broke a little more with each passing minute. When Jonathan got down on one knee in front of all their friends and family and asked Emma to marry him, she said yes because she knew she had no choice. The ring was beautiful, the proposal was romantic, and everyone applauded and congratulated them on their perfect love story. But as Emma smiled and accepted kisses and congratulations from the guests, her eyes searched the room for Victoria. She had been looking for Victoria all evening, wondering why she hadn't seen her helping with the dinner service. Emma had wanted to share a meaningful look with Victoria during the proposal, some small acknowledgement of the irony and sadness of the moment. It wasn't until much later, after all the guests had gone home, and Emma finally went up to her old bedroom to be alone with her thoughts, that she found Victoria's letter on her pillow. Emma's hands shook as she read the words that shattered her world completely. Emma read the letter 3 times before the reality of it sank in. Victoria was gone. The woman she loved, the only person who had ever made her feel truly happy and alive, had left without saying goodbye, without any warning, on the same night Emma had been forced to accept a proposal from a man she didn't love. Emma sank to the floor, still holding the letter, and finally allowed herself to cry the tears she had been holding back all evening. She cried for the love she had lost, for the life she was trapped in, and for the future that stretched ahead of her like a prison sentence. What Emma didn't know, as she grieved alone in her childhood bedroom, was that her father was responsible for her heartbreak, and that Victoria had been forced to choose between her own survival and the love they had shared. The truth would remain hidden, at least for now, but the consequences of Richard's decision would ripple through all their lives in ways none of them could have predicted. 3 months after Victoria's sudden departure, the Whitmore family seemed to have returned to normal on the surface, but underneath, everything had changed in ways that Richard had not anticipated. Emma had gone through with her engagement to Jonathan, but she had become a completely different person. The vibrant, confident young woman who had once challenged her father on business decisions and spoke her mind freely had been replaced by someone quiet, distant, and seemingly defeated. She attended all the required social events, participated in wedding planning meetings, and smiled when expected, but there was no life in her eyes anymore. Jonathan had noticed the change in his fiancée, but when he asked Emma about it, she always claimed she was just stressed about the wedding preparations. He began to wonder if she was having second thoughts about their marriage, but his own family's expectations and the business advantages of the union made it difficult for him to address his concerns directly. Richard told himself that Emma's mood was temporary, that she would recover from her infatuation with Victoria once she was married, and had real responsibilities to focus on. He had convinced himself that he had done the right thing, that protecting his daughter from a scandal that would have ruined her life was worth the temporary unhappiness she was experiencing. But Richard's confidence in his decision began to waver when he started noticing other changes in Emma's behavior. She had lost weight, rarely ate the meals prepared for her, and spent long hours alone in her room. When she did interact with family members, she was polite but cold, especially toward Richard himself. The first real crack in Richard's certainty came when he overheard a phone conversation Emma was having with her college roommate. Emma thought she was alone in the house, but Richard had returned early from a business meeting and heard her voice coming from the library. "I don't know how much longer I can pretend to be happy about this wedding," Emma was saying. "Everything feels wrong, Sarah. I feel like I'm living someone else's life." Richard paused in the hallway, listening to his daughter's conversation with growing unease. "You don't understand," Emma continued. There was someone I cared about, someone who made me feel alive and real. And then she just disappeared like she never existed. I can't get over the feeling that something terrible happened, but I don't know what. Richard felt a chill run down his spine. He had hoped that Emma would forget about Victoria quickly, but clearly, her feelings had been deeper than he had realized. "I've tried to find her," Emma went on. "I hired a private investigator, but it's like she vanished into thin air. The address she gave us was fake, her references don't check out completely, and there's no record of her working for another family in Chicago. Nothing makes sense." Richard's hands clenched into fists. He had not known that Emma was actively looking for Victoria, and the fact that she had hired a private investigator was deeply troubling. He had been careful to cover his tracks when he arranged Victoria's departure, but a professional investigator might be able to find information that Emma couldn't access on her own. "Sometimes I wonder if my father had something to do with it," Emma said, and Richard's blood ran cold. He never liked Victoria, and the timing of her leaving was so strange. Right before my engagement party, right when I needed her most. It doesn't feel like a coincidence. Richard had heard enough. He quietly backed away from the library and went to his office, his mind racing with new concerns. If Emma was already suspicious about his involvement, it was only a matter of time before she uncovered the truth. And if she discovered what he had done, the consequences could be even worse than the scandal he had tried to prevent. That evening, Richard attempted to have a conversation with Emma about her obvious unhappiness, hoping to gauge how much she suspected and perhaps convince her to focus on her future rather than the past. "Emma," he said, finding her on the terrace overlooking the garden. "I'm concerned about you. You seem distressed lately, and I want to help if I can." Emma looked at her father with an expression that was difficult to read. "I'm fine, father," she said. "Just wedding stress, as I'm sure you can understand." "Is that all it is?" Richard asked carefully. "You've seemed different since Victoria left. I know you're fond of her, but surely you understand that employees come and go. It's not worth dwelling on." Emma's eyes flashed with anger, the first real emotion Richard had seen from her in months. "Fond of her," Emma repeated. "Victoria was more than just an employee to me, and you know it." Richard felt his heart rate increase. "What do you mean by that?" "I mean that Victoria was important to me," Emma said. "She was kind to me when I was going through difficult times. She listened to me and cared about my feelings. And then she just disappeared without any real explanation." "People leave jobs all the time," Richard said, trying to keep his voice casual. "I'm sure she had good reasons for taking the position in Chicago." "Do you really believe that?" Emma asked, studying her father's face carefully. "Because I've been thinking about it a lot, and nothing about her leaving makes sense. Victoria would never have left without saying goodbye to me properly. We were close, and she knew how important she was to me." Richard realized he was walking into dangerous territory. "Emma, I think you may have misunderstood the nature of your relationship with Victoria. She was our employee, not your friend. It would have been inappropriate for her to become too personally involved with you." Emma stood up abruptly, her hands shaking with anger. "Inappropriate?" she repeated. "What exactly do you think was inappropriate about it, father?" Richard could see that he had pushed too hard, revealed too much of his own suspicions. He needed to back away from this conversation before he made things worse. "I simply mean that it's natural for young people to form attachments to people who are kind to them," Richard said carefully. "But those relationships aren't always what they seem, and it's important to maintain appropriate boundaries." Emma stared at her father for a long moment, and Richard could see her mind working, putting pieces together in a way that made him deeply uncomfortable. "You know something," Emma said quietly. "You know something about why Victoria really left." "I don't know what you mean," Richard said, but his voice sounded strained even to his own ears. "Yes, you do," Emma said, her voice growing stronger. "Victoria didn't just leave for another job. Something happened, something that made her go away without saying goodbye to me. And somehow you're involved." Richard stood up as well, trying to regain control of the conversation. "Emma, you're upset, and you're not thinking clearly. Victoria left for a better opportunity. That's all. I had nothing to do with her decision. I don't believe you, Emma said flatly. I've known you my entire life, father, and I know when you're lying to me. You did something to make Victoria leave. Richard felt panic rising in his chest. He had underestimated his daughter's intelligence and her determination to uncover the truth. He needed to find a way to shut down this line of inquiry before it went any further. Emma, even if I did have some involvement in Victoria's departure, it would have been for your own good, Richard said, immediately realizing he had made a terrible mistake. Emma's face went completely white. So you admit it, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You did something to her. Richard tried to backtrack. I didn't say that. I said even if I had been involved, which I wasn't, it would have been to protect you. Protect me from what? Emma demanded, her voice getting louder. Protect me from being happy? Protect me from someone who actually cared about me. Emma, please calm down, Richard said, but he could see that his daughter was beyond listening to reason. What did you do to her? Emma asked, tears streaming down her face. What did you do to Victoria? Richard realized that he was trapped. If he continued to deny everything, Emma would keep investigating until she found the truth. But if he admitted what he had done, the consequences would be devastating. He decided to try a different approach, appealing to Emma's sense of family loyalty. Emma, sit down, Richard said firmly. If we're going to have this conversation, we need to be rational about it. Emma remained standing, her arms crossed over her chest, but she stopped shouting. Victoria was not good for you, Richard said carefully. Your relationship with her was inappropriate and potentially damaging to your reputation and your future. I had to intervene to protect you from making a mistake that would have ruined your life. What relationship? Emma asked. What did you think was happening between Victoria and me? Richard looked at his daughter for a long moment, realizing that he was about to cross a line that would change everything between them forever. I saw you together, Richard said quietly. I saw you in bed with her, Emma. I saw how you looked at each other, how you touched each other. I know what was happening between you. Emma's face went through a range of emotions: shock, embarrassment, anger, and, finally, resignation. She sat down heavily in her chair, as if the weight of the truth was too much to bear standing up. So you knew, Emma said, her voice hollow. You knew, and you made her leave. I gave her a choice, Richard said, trying to justify his actions. I offered her a generous settlement to leave quietly, where she could face the consequences of her inappropriate behavior with my daughter. You paid her to leave me? Emma asked, her voice filled with disbelief. I gave her enough money to start a new life, Richard said. She took it willingly, Emma. She chose the money over you. Emma looked up at her father with hatred in her eyes. You threatened her, she said. Victoria would never have chosen money over me unless you threatened her with something worse. Richard realized that Emma understood exactly what had happened, and that his attempts to make Victoria seem mercenary had failed completely. She was using you, Emma. Richard tried one more time. She was a poor woman with nothing to lose and everything to gain by seducing the daughter of a wealthy family. She probably planned the whole thing from the beginning. Emma stood up again, her whole body shaking with rage. You're lying, she said. Victoria never asked me for anything. She tried to resist me because she knew it was complicated. She loved me, and you destroyed that because you couldn't stand the thought of your precious daughter being happy with someone you consider beneath her. Emma, please, Richard said, reaching toward his daughter, but she stepped away from him. Don't touch me, Emma said coldly. Don't ever touch me again. She started to walk toward the house, then turned back to face her father one more time. I want you to know something, Emma said. Victoria was the only person in my life who ever made me feel truly happy and truly loved. And you took that away from me because of your own prejudice and your obsession with controlling my life. I will never forgive you for this, and I will never forget what you've done. Emma disappeared into the house, leaving Richard alone on the terrace with the full realization of what his decision had cost him. He had saved his family from scandal, but he had lost his daughter's love and respect in the process. Over the next several weeks, Emma's behavior became increasingly erratic and defiant. She began canceling wedding planning appointments, refusing to attend social events, and openly challenging her father's authority in ways she had never done before. The final breaking point came when Emma announced that she was postponing the wedding indefinitely. Jonathan was devastated and confused by Emma's sudden change of heart. Their families tried to intervene, but Emma refused to give any explanation beyond saying that she needed time to think about her future. Richard watched helplessly as his carefully constructed plans fell apart. The business alliance he had hoped to create through Emma's marriage was in jeopardy. His relationship with his daughter was destroyed, and the scandal he tried to prevent was beginning to emerge anyway, as people started asking questions about why the wedding had been postponed. The final blow came when Emma hired a team of private investigators and lawyers to track down Victoria. Richard's attempts to hide Victoria's trail began to unravel as professionals with resources and determination started digging into the truth. When Victoria was finally located, living under a new name in a small town in Oregon, Emma made the decision that would send shockwaves through their entire world. She publicly announced that she was canceling her engagement to Jonathan permanently because she was in love with someone else, a woman named Victoria whom her father had forced out of their lives. The scandal that Richard had worked so hard to prevent exploded across the society pages and business newspapers. The story of the billionaire's daughter who had fallen in love with the family's black Maid became a sensation that dominated headlines for weeks. But for Emma, the public attention was a small price to pay for her freedom. She had found Victoria, they had been reunited, and despite everything that had happened, their love had survived. Emma walked away from her father's money, her family's expectations, and her privileged life to build something real and honest with the woman she loved. Richard was left to face the consequences of his decision alone. His business relationships suffered, his social standing was damaged, and, most importantly, he had lost the daughter he had tried so hard to protect. The fortune and reputation he had spent his life building felt meaningless without Emma's love and respect. In the end, Richard's attempt to control his daughter's life had backfired completely. His prejudice and his inability to accept Emma's choices had cost him everything that truly mattered. The scandal he had tried to prevent had happened anyway, but now it was accompanied by the additional shame of his own cruel and manipulative behavior being exposed to the world. Emma and Victoria's love story became an inspiration to others who faced similar prejudice and family pressure. They proved that love could survive even the most powerful attempts to destroy it, and that sometimes the most important choice a person can make is to choose happiness over expectation, love over duty, and authenticity over the approval of others. The billionaire's decision had indeed sent shockwaves through their world, but not in the way he had intended. Instead of protecting his family's reputation, Richard had created a scandal that exposed the ugly truth about his own character. And instead of controlling his daughter's future, he had lost her forever to the very love he had tried so hard to destroy.